group. And we had all sorts of misgivings about communists. And I have some sense of his importance, particularly since I moved to Detroit and began living in the black community. But in the rarefied atmosphere of New York and among New York radicals, one had a tendency to, disregard or underestimate what was going on in people who were pro-communist or friendly with the fellow travelers with the Communist Party.
You didn't work directly with Dr. King. You did know Malcolm X. Can you talk about the tensions at that time and how they inform what you think should be happening today?
Well, like many Black Power activists in the 60s, I tended to think of King as somewhat naive with his advocacy of nonviolence. And it took me a lot of time I identified with Malcolm much more, as many of us did in the movement in the North. And it took the rebellions of the 60s, the late 60s, and the crime and violence that began to erupt in our cities following, particularly in Detroit, following the rebellions, for me to ask, is it possible that there's something in King's message that we have to internalize in order to rebuild our cities, to redefine our cities, to respirit our cities? And it was in really beginning to face the problems of a deindustrialized Detroit and a crime-ridden and a violence-ridden Detroit, that King began to mean more to me as I began to work with young people and see how much they needed to have what he called self-transforming and environment-transforming programs that they could engage in and begin to be of use and to serve. As I began to understand the alienation of young people in our cities and the alienation that King understood, that he grasped as he tried to understand both the Vietnam War and the rebellions, the urban rebellions, people have very little idea of how hard he really struggled with that issue. We are so used to turning him into a cliche that we don't relate the challenges we now face to the challenge that he faced at the end of his life, and that Malcolm also faced, by the way. Malcolm came back from the Hajj in 1964 saying, I'm a Muslim and I'm a revolutionary, but I don't know where I'm going from there. I know I have to crawl before I walk, I have to walk before I run, and I don't think I'm going to have time to do that. So I feel that in trying to understand both King and Malcolm, and also to understand the billions of Muslims all over the world who are really trying to find another road to modernity, other than that of the United States and the calamities that it has meant for them and for the world, that we begin to understand how much we have to look into the mirror at ourselves.
Grace Lee Boggs, there's been a debate over the last few weeks among the presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, about the power of King. Also last night they debated in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. For the first half they were really going at it. Then they sat down and they agreed on a lot of things. And one of the things that Barack Obama said when asked whether, who would Dr. King endorse, something like that, the debate happening on Dr. King Day. Barack Obama said he wouldn't endorse any of us. He was speaking as a presidential candidate. He said he'd be leading a movement to pressure us. Can you talk about how you've seen this debate play out over the last few weeks and where you stand?
Well, I think it's wonderful, by the way, that both Hillary and Obama are running and that they're front runners in this campaign, because I think they help us to see that it's not a question of race or gender. It's a question of whether we encourage the movement and unleash the movement of people from below, or whether we try to run things from above, from the White House. And though I consider myself a feminist, I have to look at what Hillary stands for in terms of top-down leadership. And I have to understand I have to look at Obama and see that younger people, a new generation, is emerging and looking for the kind of healing that this country needs. And that he has unleashed that, though his policies are not that different from Clinton's. But he has unleashed an energy in the young people particularly, which has great promise. And he has also helped to unfreeze the unity that existed among blacks. He's helped us to see that all blacks are not the same. I think that people have become that in the interest of unity, blacks who have not actually been in the same place, some of them are in the White House, and some of them are in the Supreme Court, and some of them are in Congress, and others are groping with very fundamental questions of daily life. And that split actually exists in the country, it actually exists in the community, but this campaign has helped us to see, to begin to grapple with that difference.
Grace Lee Boggs, you're not...
That's a very important development, not just for the black community, but for this country. There was an unfreezing that began to take place in the Jackson administration when the Federalist Party died, and we had the beginning of the birth of the Democrats. That same kind of unfreezing is going on right now.
We're talking to Grace Lee Boggs. She is in Detroit, Michigan. You are not usually deeply involved in electoral politics, yet here you are deeply believing in the significance of what's happening this year. What has changed? And did you ever have hope in other electoral years, in other presidential times of presidential elections?
I've never had this much hope. I've never had, because I think this one is unique. You know, policy-wise, I think Dennis Kucinich is much more on the right track. In fact, I support him. But he does not have that particular combination of a Kenya father and a Kansas mother that can help unleash different energies. You know, sometimes he can't help it, of course, but sometimes it takes a certain person to do that. And I don't think, it's not, to me, it's not so important, the electoral politics, how they will develop, I don't know. But when I felt that energy of young people, and I feel it around here, and I think of what Fanon said about each generation emerging out of obscurity must define its mission and fulfill or betray it. We're living at one of those tide times.
What do you think are the key issues right now? And for people who are grassroots activists, as you are, what do you think their role is in this year of a presidential race that you think is so key?
Well, Barack Obama used a phrase in the speech at Ebenezer, which I think we have to sort of embrace. He said we have to lead